The autumn sun was just beginning to set over downtown Atlanta, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple. The streets were bustling with the usual evening crowd. Business people heading home, couples walking hand in hand, and the occasional group of tourists taking photos of the historic buildings. Among them walked Eleanor Washington, a 68-year-old woman whose gentle appearance masked a lifetime of fighting for justice. Eleanor had just wrapped up another productive community board meeting at the local library. The main topic had been improving access to legal aid for low-income families, a cause that had been close to her heart throughout her 40-year career as a civil rights attorney. Despite being officially retired, she couldn't help but stay involved in community work. "There's always more work to be done," she often told her grandchildren. As she walked down Pedersen Street, her sensible brown shoes clicking softly against the sidewalk, Eleanor felt proud of how far the city had come since her early days as a young lawyer. Back then, many of these buildings wouldn't have welcomed someone who looked like her. Yet here she was, decades later, planning to dine at Bellamy's, one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city. Her friend Rose had recommended Bellamy's just last week at their monthly book club meeting. "The food is absolutely heavenly," Rose had gushed, "and the atmosphere makes you feel like royalty." Eleanor smiled at the memory as she adjusted her pearl necklace, a graduation gift from her late mother, who had worked as a housekeeper to put Eleanor through law school. The evening air had a slight chill to it, and Eleanor pulled her navy cardigan closer around her shoulders. She'd chosen to dress comfortably today, prioritizing practicality over flash. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her face carried the kind wisdom that comes only from years of both joy and struggle. The simple golden wedding band on her finger caught the last rays of sunlight, a reminder of her husband Thomas, who had passed away 3 years ago but would have loved this restaurant's famous peach cobbler. As she approached Bellamy's, Eleanor took in the elegant facade. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a beautifully restored Victorian building, with large windows offering glimpses of crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths inside. The brass door handles gleamed, and perfectly maintained flower boxes added splashes of color to the entrance. A young couple was just leaving, looking happy and well-fed, the man holding the door open for Eleanor with a polite smile. Inside, the restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clinking of fine china. The aroma of seared steaks and fresh-baked bread filled the air, making Eleanor realize just how hungry she was. The maitre d' was busy with another group, so Eleanor took a moment to admire the restaurant's decor. The walls featured beautiful black and white photographs of old Atlanta, and she recognized several landmarks from her childhood. She hadn't planned on dining alone tonight. Originally, she was supposed to meet her colleague Anne from the restaurant licensing board, but Anne had called earlier to cancel due to a sick grandchild. Eleanor had decided to keep the reservation anyway. After all, there was nothing wrong with treating yourself to a nice meal after a productive day. What Eleanor didn't know as she stood there, taking in the elegant atmosphere, was that this quiet evening was about to become anything but ordinary. In just a few minutes, she would find herself at the center of a situation that would spark conversations across the city and remind everyone that sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't who you might expect. As she waited to be acknowledged by the staff, Eleanor reached into her sensible leather handbag and pulled out her reading glasses, preparing to look over the menu. She had already heard wonderful things about their roasted salmon, and she was looking forward to experiencing the restaurant's renowned service for herself. After all, as a member of the restaurant licensing board, she had a professional interest in seeing how one of the city's most talked-about establishments operated. The warm lighting cast a gentle glow over the dining room, and soft jazz played in the background. It was exactly the kind of peaceful evening Eleanor had been looking forward to all day. She had no way of knowing that in just a few moments, this peaceful scene would transform into something entirely different, a reminder that despite all the progress that had been made, there were still battles to be fought and lessons to be learned in the most unexpected places. The first hint that something was off came when Eleanor noticed none of the staff would make eye contact with her. She had been standing patiently by the entrance for nearly 5 minutes, her comfortable shoes keeping her feet steady on the polished marble floor. Around her, other guests were being greeted warmly and shown to their tables right away. A young couple who had arrived after her was already being seated at a prime window table. Finally, a tall man in a crisp black suit approached. This was James Barrett, the restaurant manager, though Eleanor didn't know it yet. He moved with the kind of artificial authority that some people wear like an expensive cologne, a bit too strong and not quite natural. His perfectly polished shoes clicked against the floor as he walked over, and Eleanor noticed his name tag gleamed as brightly as his forced smile. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting the opposite of assistance. His eyes darted past Eleanor to the door, as if hoping she was just asking for directions to somewhere else. Eleanor had seen that look before, many times over her long career. It was the look of someone who had already decided who belonged and who didn't. "Yes, I have a reservation for one," Eleanor replied warmly, choosing to ignore his tone. "It should be under Washington." She watched as Barrett made a show of checking the reservation book, his finger sliding down the page with exaggerated movement. "I don't seem to see that name here," he said, though Eleanor could clearly see her name written in black ink from where she stood. She had made the reservation 3 days ago and had even received a confirmation call that morning. "Perhaps you missed it," Eleanor suggested gently. "I confirmed it just this morning. I'd be happy to show you the email on my phone." She reached into her handbag, but Barrett quickly raised his hand to stop her. "That won't be necessary," he said, his voice growing louder. A few nearby diners began to glance in their direction. "You see, we're fully booked this evening." He gestured vaguely around the restaurant, where at least 7 empty tables were clearly visible, their white tablecloths pristine and undisturbed. Eleanor took a slow, deep breath. In her decades of legal work, she had learned that moments like these required careful handling. She had faced down far more intimidating opponents in federal courtrooms, but there was still something deeply painful about such blatant dismissal. "I can see several empty tables from here," she pointed out calmly, "including that lovely corner booth by the window." Her voice remained steady, though she could feel her pulse quickening slightly. The pearl necklace her mother had given her felt a bit heavier around her neck. Barrett's face flushed slightly, and his smile became even more artificial. "Those tables are reserved for our regular customers," he said, emphasizing the word regular in a way that made his meaning crystal clear. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments on the south side. The food there might be more suitable to your tastes." A few gasps came from nearby tables. An elderly white couple at the closest table exchanged uncomfortable glances, the woman's hand covering her mouth in shock. A young waitress hovering nearby looked down at her shoes, her face red with embarrassment. Eleanor stood her ground, her posture straight but not aggressive. She had spent too many years fighting for dignity in courtrooms and classrooms to let it be stripped away here. "I would like to speak to your supervisor," she said firmly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby without seeming confrontational. Barrett's face darkened. "I am the manager here, and I've made my decision. Now, if you continue to cause a disturbance, I'll have no choice but to call security." He reached for the phone at the host station, his hand hovering over it in a clear threat. The restaurant had grown quieter now, the usual dinner chatter dying down as more people turned to watch the scene unfolding. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others merely curious, a few deliberately looking away. She thought about all the others who had faced similar treatment but didn't have her resources or experience to fight back. A young man at a nearby table had quietly taken out his phone and was recording the interaction. Others were whispering among themselves, and Eleanor could see several people looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. She noticed one woman in particular who seemed to be typing frantically on her phone. She would later learn this was a local food critic who recognized her from her years of public service. Barrett was still standing there, his hand now firmly on the phone, waiting for her next move. What he didn't realize was that Eleanor Washington had spent her entire career preparing for moments exactly like this one. She reached into her handbag again, this time pulling out not just her phone, but also her business card holder. The gold lettering on her cards still clearly showed her position on the city's restaurant licensing board, though Barrett was too focused on trying to intimidate her to notice. The next few moments would change not just the evening, but the entire trajectory of Bellamy's restaurant and its staff. Elena straightened her cardigan, touched her mother's pearls for strength, and prepared to handle the situation with the same grace and strategic thinking that had made her one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the South. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the restaurant as the situation continued to unfold. Elena stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, while Barrett's voice grew increasingly loud and hostile. The peaceful dinner atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by a tense silence broken only by his sharp words and the occasional clink of silverware from uncomfortable diners. "I've told you several times now," Barrett announced, practically shouting, "this establishment has certain standards." He emphasized the word standards while looking pointedly at Eleanor's simple cardigan and comfortable shoes. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who doesn't meet them." A young family at a nearby table quickly asked for their check, the parents exchanging knowing looks as they gathered their children's things. Their young daughter, no more than 7, tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Mommy, why is that man being so mean to the nice lady?" The child's innocent question hung in the air, making several other diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. An older gentleman in a business suit slowly put down his fork, his half-eaten steak forgotten as he watched the scene with growing concern. His dining companion, wearing an expensive pearl necklace similar to Eleanor's, dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Eleanor felt a familiar ache in her chest, not from fear or shame, but from the weight of history. She had seen this scene play out countless times over her decades as a civil rights attorney. Different faces, different places, but always the same story. Her mind drifted briefly to her grandmother, who had worked as a cook in a restaurant just like this one, but had never been allowed to eat in the dining room. "Sir," Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear, "I understand you're doing your job as you see fit, but I want you to think carefully about what's happening here." She paused, making sure her words carried to those nearby without seeming confrontational. "Is this really about standards, or is it about something else?" Barrett's face flushed an even deeper shade of red. He gestured to 2 security guards who had appeared near the kitchen entrance. They were young men who looked more embarrassed than intimidating, clearly uncomfortable with the situation they were being drawn into. "This woman," Barrett announced loudly, pointing directly at Eleanor, "is disrupting our business and making other guests uncomfortable." He looked around the room as if seeking support, but found only averted eyes and disapproving looks. A middle-aged couple at a window table stood up abruptly, the husband pulling out his wallet. "Actually," the wife said clearly, "you're the one making everyone uncomfortable." She placed her napkin on her half-finished plate. "We'll be leaving now, and we won't be back until your establishment learns about basic human decency." The security guards hung back, exchanging uncertain glances. One of them, barely out of his 20s, kept looking between Eleanor and Barrett as if trying to solve a complicated math problem. His hand nervously adjusted his tie, and he made no move to approach. A young waitress who had been watching everything dropped a stack of menus on the host station with a loud clatter. She pulled off her apron and placed it next to the menus. "I quit," she said simply, then walked toward the door, pausing only to squeeze Eleanor's shoulder gently as she passed. The restaurant's sophisticated sound system continued playing soft jazz, creating an oddly jarring soundtrack to the scene. Through the windows, Eleanor could see people on the sidewalk starting to slow down and peer inside, drawn by the commotion. A few had their phones out, recording through the glass. "You're making a big mistake," Barrett said, his voice slightly lower but still sharp with anger. "Do you have any idea who I am? I've been running fine dining establishments for 20 years. Who do you think you are to come in here and cause this kind of scene?" Eleanor reached into her handbag once again, this time pulling out her business cards. The sight of her credentials would soon change everything, but for now, she took a moment to look around the room. She saw the faces of the other diners, some angry, some ashamed, some already pulling out their phones to make calls or post on social media. She saw the young security guards, probably working their way through college, faced with a moral choice they never expected to make on a routine shift. Most importantly, she saw Barrett, a man so caught up in his own prejudices that he couldn't see the damage he was doing, not just to her evening, but to his restaurant, his employees, and his own reputation. In all her years of fighting for justice, Elena had learned that moments like these were opportunities. They were chances to turn pain into progress, to transform discrimination into dialogue. The business card in her hand felt heavy with possibility. In a few moments, she would reveal who she really was, and the entire dynamic would shift dramatically. But right now, standing in the middle of Bellamy's elegant dining room, Eleanor Washington was simultaneously every person who had ever been told they didn't belong and every person who had ever stood up and proved otherwise. The truth about Eleanor Washington was about to turn this entire situation on its head. As she stood there in Bellamy's dining room, holding her business card, 30 years of legal victories, community leadership, and public service were about to come to light. But the real power wasn't in her titles or positions, it was in the journey that had brought her to this moment. Back in 1975, Eleanor had been the only black woman in her law school graduating class. She'd worked as a janitor in the evenings to pay for her textbooks, mopping the very courthouse floors where she would later win groundbreaking cases. Her professors had told her she'd never make it in the legal world, but Eleanor had simply smiled and studied harder. In the early 1980s, she'd become known as the quiet storm in legal circles. While other lawyers shouted and pounded tables, Eleanor won her cases with careful preparation and unshakable calm. She had taken down corporate giants, fought against housing discrimination, and helped integrate some of the very restaurants that had once refused to serve her own parents. Now, as a member of the city's restaurant licensing board, she reviewed complaints about discriminatory practices in local establishments. Just last week, she'd been appointed to head a special committee investigating reports of bias in high-end restaurants. The irony of this situation would soon become crystal clear to everyone, especially Barrett. A young food blogger sitting near the bar had already recognized Eleanor. The blogger's fingers were flying across her phone's keyboard, pulling up articles about Eleanor's legendary career. There was the famous case where she'd helped black business owners win a landmark lawsuit against a banking system that had denied them loans. Then the time she'd served as lead prosecutor in a federal discrimination case that made national headlines. The security guards were still hanging back, looking increasingly uncertain. The younger one had pulled out his phone and was quietly Googling Eleanor's name. Someone in the restaurant had whispered it just loud enough for him to hear. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the search results. Barrett, still red-faced and angry, had no idea that he was currently threatening a woman who had argued and won 3 cases before the state Supreme Court. He couldn't know that the simple cardigan Eleanor wore had been given to her by the governor's wife after Eleanor received the state's highest civilian honor for public service. The pearl necklace that Barrett had looked down on. It had been featured in a newspaper photo when Eleanor became the first black woman to serve as a federal prosecutor in the state. The comfortable shoes he'd sneered at had walked the halls of justice for 3 decades, leaving footprints that law students now studied in their textbooks. At one of the corner tables, an older man in a business suit suddenly sat up straighter, recognition dawning on his face. He had been one of Eleanor's law students 20 years ago and now served as a corporate attorney. He watched the scene unfold with a mixture of anger and anticipation, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Eleanor's position on the restaurant licensing board wasn't just a title, it came with real power to investigate discrimination complaints and recommend suspension or revocation of business licenses. The committee she headed had the authority to conduct surprise inspections, mandate sensitivity training, and impose substantial fines. But more than any official power, Eleanor carried the wisdom and strength of generations. Her grandmother had been a cook who wasn't allowed to eat in restaurants like this. Her mother had been a housekeeper who had sacrificed everything to send Eleanor to law school. Now, Eleanor stood in this dining room not just as herself, but as a representative of everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The business card in her hand told only part of the story. Yes, it listed her impressive title and position on the licensing board. But it couldn't capture the thousands of hours she'd spent building cases, the late nights poring over legal documents, or the countless times she'd turned discrimination into opportunity for positive change. A local news reporter, who had been enjoying a quiet dinner at the bar, had already recognized Eleanor from countless press conferences and public hearings. She sat with her phone discreetly recording, knowing that this story was about to become much bigger than a simple dinner reservation. What Barrett saw was an older black woman in simple clothes who he thought didn't belong in his upscale restaurant. What he failed to see was one of the most influential civil rights attorneys in the state's history, a woman who had helped write the very laws that protected people from the kind of discrimination he was currently displaying. Eleanor took one last look around the dining room before she prepared to speak. She saw the faces of the other diners, some already understanding what was about to happen, others still waiting to see how this would unfold. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice. "Sometimes, baby, the best lesson comes wrapped in the hardest moment." The truth about who Eleanor Washington really was wouldn't just change this evening, it would transform Bellamy's restaurant forever. But more importantly, it would remind everyone present that you can never judge someone's power, dignity, or worth by their appearance. The next few moments would prove that sometimes the most impactful changes come from the quietest warriors. The quiet clicking of phone cameras filled the air as Eleanor calmly reached for her own phone. She had learned long ago that documentation was often the key to creating real change. The restaurant's elegant lighting cast a warm glow over the scene, making every detail crystal clear in the recordings that would soon spread across social media and news outlets. A young couple at a nearby table had been recording since Barrett first raised his voice. The wife, her hands slightly shaking with anger, made sure to capture his dismissive gestures and Eleanor's composed responses. Her husband whispered, "I can't believe this is happening in 2024. This isn't right." The food blogger who had recognized Eleanor was already live-streaming the incident to her followers. "You're not going to believe who they're trying to kick out of Bellamy's right now," she narrated quietly. "That's Eleanor Washington. Yes, the Eleanor Washington." Comments and reactions started pouring in immediately, with many of her followers sharing their own stories of discrimination at upscale restaurants. In the corner, the corporate attorney who had once been Eleanor's student was typing furiously on his phone, reaching out to his law firm's partners. "You need to see this," his message read. "Remember that discrimination case from '92? That's my old professor they're harassing." Within minutes, 3 other partners at his firm were tuning into the growing number of live streams. Eleanor's own phone was now recording steadily, capturing Barrett's increasingly flustered behavior. She held it at waist level, maintaining her dignified posture while ensuring every word was documented. Years of legal work had taught her the value of clear, undeniable evidence. "I want everyone to note the time and date," Eleanor said clearly, her voice carrying through the now quiet restaurant. "It's 7:42 p.m. on a Thursday evening. I have a confirmed reservation, which was denied despite multiple empty tables. The manager has threatened to call security because, in his words, I don't meet their standards." The local news reporter at the bar had shifted into full journalist mode. Her trained eye caught every detail: the empty tables that proved Barrett's fully booked claim false, the way other diners were being seated without question, the visible discomfort of the staff as they watched their manager's behavior. Her notes would later form the basis of a powerful investigative piece about ongoing discrimination in the city's high-end dining scene. Social media was already lighting up. Someone had posted a photo of Eleanor receiving her Civil Rights Award from the governor last year, side by side with a current photo of her being discriminated against at Bellamy's. The contrast was striking and powerful. Comments and shares multiplied by the minute. "This woman helped integrate our schools, and they won't even serve her dinner. Isn't she on the restaurant licensing board? My grandmother worked with her on the housing discrimination case in '89. She's a legend." The young security guards had completely backed away now, one of them quietly calling his supervisor to report the situation. He had found Eleanor's professional biography online and realized the gravity of the situation. "Boss, we've got a serious problem here," he whispered into his phone. "The woman they want us to remove, she's basically the most important civil rights attorney in the state." Barrett, still unaware of Eleanor's identity, noticed all the phones pointed in his direction. His confidence began to waver slightly, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Recording me won't change anything," he announced, his voice slightly less steady now. "This is a private establishment." An older couple who had been regular customers at Bellamy's for 15 years stood up from their table. The husband walked to the host station and asked for their check, making sure Barrett could hear him say, "We won't be back until there's new management." His wife was already posting a detailed review of the incident on every restaurant rating site she could find. Through it all, Eleanor maintained her composed documentation of the scene. Each passing minute was being preserved from multiple angles, creating an undeniable record of the discrimination taking place. Her phone captured Barrett's nervous glances at the growing number of recording devices, the supportive nods from other diners, and the whispered conversations as more people recognized her. The young waitress who had quit was now outside the restaurant, talking to a small crowd that had gathered. Word was spreading quickly through the downtown area. A civil rights organization's local chapter president was already on his way, having seen the live streams. He had worked with Eleanor on several community initiatives and couldn't believe this was happening to her. Social media channels were ablaze with activity. Local community groups were sharing the live streams, adding context about Eleanor's decades of service to the city. Someone had dug up a photo from 20 years ago, Eleanor standing on the courthouse steps after winning a landmark discrimination case against another restaurant chain. The irony was lost on no one. Eleanor's phone continued recording as she finally prepared to reveal her identity to Barrett. The documentation of this moment would serve multiple purposes: evidence for the licensing board's investigation, material for future sensitivity training sessions, and a powerful reminder that discrimination often reveals itself most clearly when the perpetrator doesn't realize who they're dealing with. The crystal chandeliers of Bellamy's were about to witness a moment that would be played and replayed in news reports, documentary films, and civil rights seminars for years to come. Every phone in the room was ready to capture what would happen next as Eleanor Washington prepared to transform from a victim of discrimination into a powerful agent of change. The next morning started early at Bellamy's restaurant, with the owner's phone ringing at 6 a.m. He was already awake, having spent most of the night watching videos of the incident that had spread across social media like wildfire. The owner, a man who had inherited the restaurant from his father, sat in his home office with his head in his hands, watching his family's legacy crumble in real time. By 7 a.m., news vans were parked outside the restaurant. The morning shows were running the story on repeat. Prestigious restaurant manager attempts to remove civil rights icon. The videos captured by diners told the story perfectly. Barrett's dismissive attitude, Eleanor's dignity, and the moment when everyone realized exactly who they were dealing with. The restaurant's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls. Regular customers were canceling their standing reservations. Community leaders were demanding explanations. Food critics were requesting comments for their articles. The restaurant's social media pages were flooded with thousands of comments, many sharing their own experiences with discrimination at upscale establishments. Inside the empty restaurant, an emergency board meeting was taking place. The owner had called in his entire management team, his lawyers, and his public relations advisors. They sat around the same tables where, just hours before, diners had witnessed Barrett's shocking behavior. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the tension on everyone's faces. How did no one recognize her? One of the board members asked, staring at the newspaper article about Eleanor that someone had brought in. The photo showed her receiving an award from the State Bar Association, wearing the same pearl necklace she'd had on the night before. She's served on more community boards than I can count. She literally helps decide if restaurants keep their licenses. The PR team was already drafting their third statement of the morning. The first two had been rejected for being too defensive. They knew they were dealing with more than just a PR crisis. This was a moment that could either destroy the restaurant or become an opportunity for genuine change. Barrett had been placed on immediate administrative leave. He sat alone in his apartment, watching his professional reputation dissolve with each new share of the video. His phone was filled with messages from other restaurant managers in the city, all distancing themselves from him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had tried to exclude others now found himself excluded from his own professional community. By mid-morning, the story had gone national. Major news networks were running segments about the incident, using it as a launching point for broader discussions about ongoing discrimination in the service industry. They played clips of Eleanor's past interviews about civil rights, contrasting her decades of fighting for equality with the treatment she'd received at Bellamy's. The restaurant's younger staff members were speaking out too. The waitress who had quit on the spot had given several interviews, describing a pattern of subtle discrimination she had witnessed but been afraid to challenge. Her courage in walking out had inspired others to share their stories, creating a ripple effect throughout the industry. local civil rights organizations began organizing peaceful protests outside the restaurant. They carried signs with quotes from Eleanor's famous court cases, cases where she had fought against the very kind of discrimination she had experienced firsthand. The protesters were joined by several of Bellamy's regular customers, who chose to stand in solidarity rather than dine in silence. The Restaurant Licensing Board, where Eleanor served as a senior member, called an emergency session. They had received dozens of formal complaints overnight, not just about Bellamy's but about similar incidents at other high-end establishments. Eleanor's experience had opened a floodgate of testimonials from people who had faced similar treatment but hadn't known how to fight back. By afternoon, the owner knew he had to take decisive action. His family had opened Bellamy's 60 years ago, and while they had eventually integrated when forced to by law, they had never truly addressed the underlying biases that still lingered in their operation. Now, watching the crowds outside his restaurant grow larger by the hour, he realized this was about much more than just one incident or one manager. The restaurant's training manual, untouched for years, was pulled out for review. The hiring policies that had resulted in an almost entirely white management team were scrutinized. The dress code that had been used to selectively exclude certain customers was highlighted for revision. Every aspect of the operation that could have contributed to discriminatory practices was being examined under the harsh light of public scrutiny. Local business schools were already contacting the Restaurant Licensing Board, asking permission to use this incident as a case study in their management courses. They wanted to teach future restaurant managers about the importance of inclusive practices and the costly consequences of discrimination. As evening approached, the owner sat down to write a personal letter to Eleanor Washington. He knew that a simple apology wouldn't be enough. This moment called for real, lasting change. As he wrote, he could hear the chants from the protesters outside, calling for justice and equality. The letter would be the first step in what would become a complete transformation of not just Bellamy's, but the entire city's restaurant culture. The consequences of that evening were still unfolding, touching not just one restaurant or one manager, but an entire industry that had too often hidden its discriminatory practices behind dress codes and reservation policies. What Barrett hadn't realized when he tried to turn Eleanor away was that he had inadvertently sparked a movement that would force long-overdue changes in restaurants across the city. 3 months after the incident, Bellamy's restaurant looked very different. The same crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, but they now shone down on a transformed establishment. Eleanor Washington sat at the best table in the house, surrounded by community leaders, as they celebrated the launch of the Future Leaders in Hospitality Scholarship Program. The program, funded by Bellamy's and several other high-end restaurants in the city, would provide full scholarships to culinary school for students from underrepresented communities. The idea had come from Eleanor herself, who believed that real change had to start from the ground up. Rather than pursuing legal action against the restaurant, she had seen an opportunity to create something positive from the painful experience. Sometimes the best response to discrimination isn't punishment, Eleanor explained to a young journalism student who was covering the event. It's opening doors that were previously closed. She smiled as she watched the first group of scholarship recipients touring the kitchen, their eyes wide with possibility. The restaurant's new manager, a highly qualified woman with 20 years of experience in the industry, was giving the tour. She had been handpicked by a diverse hiring committee that included Eleanor and other community leaders. Under her leadership, Bellamy's had implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all staff members, from dishwashers to executives. The old dress code policy had been replaced with simple, clear guidelines that couldn't be used as tools for discrimination. The reservation system was now fully transparent, with all bookings handled through a fair and documented process. These changes had inspired other restaurants in the city to review and update their own policies. In the kitchen, one of the scholarship recipients was learning about the restaurant's history from an elderly cook who had worked there for 30 years. "I remember when my own mama couldn't eat here," the cook said softly. "Now look at you, learning to run the whole place. That's what I call progress." The restaurant's walls now featured a new collection of photographs. Alongside the historic images of old Atlanta, there were now photos celebrating the city's diverse culinary heritage. One particular photo held a place of honor near the entrance, Eleanor's mother in her youth, standing proudly in her housekeeper's uniform. Below it was a quote, "Every meal served is a chance to nourish not just the body, but the spirit of our community." The incident had sparked a citywide conversation about subtle discrimination in the service industry. The Restaurant Licensing Board, with Eleanor's guidance, had created a task force to address these issues. They developed new guidelines for reviewing discrimination complaints and established a mentorship program pairing experienced restaurant owners with new entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds. Former manager Barrett had undergone his own transformation. After months of reflection and counseling, he had written a public letter acknowledging his biases and describing his journey to understand their impact. He now volunteered with a community organization that worked to bridge racial divides, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and an example of how people could learn and change. The young waitress who had quit that night was back at Bellamy's, but in a new role. She had been promoted to training coordinator, responsible for teaching new staff members about inclusion and respect. That night changed everything, she told a local reporter. Standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Eleanor's regular table by the window had become something of a legend. Every Thursday evening, she would come in for dinner, often joined by law students or young activists seeking her advice. The table had become an informal classroom where she shared her decades of wisdom about creating change through patience, persistence, and strategic thinking. The scholarship program was already showing promising results. Its first class included aspiring chefs, restaurant managers, and food critics from all walks of life. They brought fresh perspectives to the industry, challenging old assumptions and creating new traditions. One student had even developed a fusion menu combining her grandmother's soul food recipes with classical French techniques. Local business schools now used the Bellamy's case study to teach future managers about the importance of inclusive leadership. The case study didn't just focus on what went wrong that night, but on how the restaurant had transformed its failure into an opportunity for growth and positive change. Eleanor's pearl necklace, the one her mother had given her for graduation, took on new meaning. She had worn it the night of the incident, and she wore it again at every scholarship ceremony. It became a symbol of persistence, of dignity maintained in the face of discrimination, and of the power of turning negative experiences into positive change. The restaurant industry in the city had undergone a noticeable shift. Other establishments had followed Bellamy's lead, implementing similar training programs and reviewing their hiring practices. The city's dining scene was becoming known not just for its food, but for its commitment to equality and inclusion. As Eleanor sat at her table that evening, watching the diverse crowd of diners enjoying their meals, she thought about how far they'd come. The incident that could have ended in bitter legal battles had instead sparked a movement of positive change. It proved what she had always believed, that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't anger or revenge, but the quiet, persistent work of creating a better future for everyone. The story of that night at Bellamy's would be told for years to come, not just as a tale of discrimination, but as an example of how one moment of injustice, handled with dignity and wisdom, could lead to lasting positive change. Eleanor's quiet strength had transformed not just one restaurant, but an entire community's understanding of what it meant to truly welcome everyone to the table.